"You don't need to get involved, lady. This is none of your business," he said sharply, his tone dismissive. Stepped toward her and suddenly shoving her to the side. It was a forceful shove that sent Patricia stumbling back. She barely caught herself on the marble floor, her cane slipping from her fingers for a moment, before she regained her balance. The mall was bustling, like any other ordinary afternoon. Yet, there was nothing ordinary about Patricia Williams. At 72, she was no longer the face of young ambition. Her hair had grayed, her step had slowed, but her eyes, those eyes, were sharp. They had seen more than most could ever comprehend. More than the young officers in the mall, with their shiny badges and youthful arrogance. Patricia wasn't just an old woman with a cane and a soft smile. She wasn't just a grandmother with a few gray hairs tucked under a scarf. She was the queen of this kingdom. The marble floors she walked on? They were hers. Every brick in the walls of Kingston Mall hers. Every lease signed, every store clerk hired, every decision made behind closed doors, all hers. Yet, there she stood, sipping her coffee, surrounded by oblivious shoppers, when a young cop with fire in his eyes decided to make a judgment. He pushed her hard. As he shoved her aside, Patricia's grip tightened around her cane, but her face remained calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't retaliate. For a moment, there was silence. The chaos of the mall faded into the background as Patricia steadied herself, looking at the young officer with eyes that had witnessed more than he could ever understand. She didn't need to say a word. She didn't need to prove a point. Patricia had waited a lifetime for moments like these, when strength wasn't about action, but presence. And as the officer stood there, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed, Patricia's mind was already 2 steps ahead. This wasn't over. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I want to welcome you all to Life Stories by Ria, where we tell thrilling stories that uncover truth, character, and the power of real justice. Here, we expose the raw realities of life. If you are new here, don't make it your last. Join us every day as we bring you stories and voices that matter to your screen, with twists and turns that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Kindly hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notification because every click from you encourages us to do better. Don't click away yet. Watch this till the end. Like the video, share it with someone because the story you are about to watch will not just teach you how to handle certain situations in life, it will also remind you that true power doesn't shout. It stands still. To our returning subscribers, thank you so much for being here. You bring dignity and voice to every story we share here. Now, let's get back to the story. The air inside Kingston Mall was thick with the usual hum of chatter and hurried footsteps. But for Patricia Williams, the familiar buzz of the mall, her mall, was only background noise. It had always been that way, and she was used to the sounds of people bustling in and out, their lives unfolding in tiny moments she'd never notice. But this was different. Patricia had been walking toward the coffee stand, her cane tapping gently on the floor in rhythmic intervals. She was no stranger to this mall, but it wasn't the size of the space or the way the marble floors gleamed that mattered anymore. It was hers. She had built it, alongside her late husband, from the ground up. The mall was more than just a business. It was her legacy. Every inch of it spoke of hard work, sacrifice, and quiet pride. And as always, she moved through it like the matriarch she was. But today, everything changed in an instant. Patricia had just passed a jewelry store when she saw the officer. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with a red face and an angry, tight jaw that didn't belong in a mall. He was speaking sharply to a teenager, his hands gripping the boy's shoulder as he pinned him against the wall, the scuff of his boots against the polished floors echoing through the space. Patricia paused, her grip tightening on her cane. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. No one should be treated like that, not in her mall. "Excuse me," she called, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, not demanding, but clear. "Is there a problem here?" The officer's eyes snapped up to her, his brows furrowed, and without hesitation, he stepped toward her, his hand suddenly shoving her to the side. It wasn't a tap or a brush of the hand. It was a forceful shove that sent Patricia stumbling back. She barely caught herself on the marble floor, her cane slipping from her fingers for a moment, before she regained her balance. The young officer didn't look at her. He didn't apologize. He just stood there, chest puffed, glaring down at the boy he had been manhandling. He didn't know who Patricia was. Not the person who owned every inch of the building he was standing in. She gripped the counter of the coffee stand for a moment to steady herself, the shock of the shove settling deep into her bones. Her heart didn't race. It didn't have to. Patricia had lived a life full of moments like this, small, dismissive gestures from people who thought they knew better, thought they could push her around. She had learned long ago that she didn't need to shout to be heard. But this was different. Patricia looked up at the officer, who was now focused entirely on the boy again. He didn't see her. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. He just acted as though she was invisible, just another piece of the landscape he could shove out of his way. She took a slow breath. Then she spoke. "Excuse me," she said again, her voice calm and measured, cutting through the tension. "You don't push people like that. Especially not me." The officer didn't respond, but he turned slightly to face her, his face flushed with frustration. "You don't need to get involved, lady," he said sharply, his tone dismissive. "This is none of your business." Patricia's eyes narrowed, her grip returning to the cane, the weight of years of experience settling into her shoulders. She wasn't some helpless old woman. She wasn't a person to be shoved aside, not here, not in her place. Not by him. Not by anyone. "I've been here longer than you've been alive," Patricia said quietly, her voice low but laced with undeniable authority. "And if you're going to throw your weight around, you should know who you're throwing it at." The officer hesitated for just a moment. His expression flickered, just barely, before he looked back at the boy, still cowering against the wall. Patricia could feel the change in the air. He hadn't expected her to stand her ground. He hadn't expected her to be the one who wouldn't flinch. "I'm not going to ask you again," the officer growled, his voice rising in anger. "Move along or I'll have to deal with you too." Patricia didn't flinch. She just stood there, the weight of the years she had spent fighting for what she had built settling like a steady, unmovable force within her. Her cane was now an extension of her will, the small symbol of a woman who had fought against every odd, against every person who ever tried to push her down. The crowd around them had started to notice, the whispers of confusion and disbelief rising in the air like smoke. "Are you done?" Patricia asked, her voice cutting through the rising tension. The officer looked at her, and for the first time, something flickered in his eyes. He wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't sure who she was or why she was standing in front of him like a wall. Patricia, however, was no stranger to walls. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he muttered, turning away to finally release the boy from his grip, pushing him roughly aside as he walked past Patricia, his face flushed with both anger and shame. Patricia, however, stood still, her cane planted firmly on the ground. As the officer walked away, she realized the moment had changed her. Not just her, but the mall, her world. The things she had built over years of hard work were now in the crosshairs of something bigger. She hadn't come here to make a scene. She hadn't come here to stand up to a young cop who thought he could get away with anything. But she was here. And she wasn't going anywhere. The last thing the officer saw before he turned was Patricia's gaze, the quiet resolve in her eyes, the weight of the legacy she carried, the knowledge that no matter how young or strong they were, they couldn't push her out of her own world. The faint hum of the mall's air conditioning was the only sound as Patricia made her way down the hallway toward her office. Her cane clicked rhythmically against the marble floors, its sound almost soothing against the backdrop of the heavy silence that had followed the officer's shove. She didn't hurry. She never did. People rushed through life, but Patricia knew better. Life wasn't a race. It was about purpose, about steady steps that carried weight, meaning, and history. As she walked, the weight of the encounter with the officer settled into her bones. She wasn't angry, not yet. But something in the way he had dismissed her, shoved her aside as though she were invisible, brought back memories of a time when people did the same to her. Only, back then, she was the one who had to fight for a place at the table. Now, things were different. Or so she had thought. The mall was hers, but that didn't mean it was immune to the world outside. It didn't shield her from the same biases that still ran through the veins of society. That was the cruel irony of it all. how even the strongest pillars of success could be shaken by something so small, so sudden. As she reached the elevator doors, Patricia paused for a moment, staring at her reflection in the glass. Her silver-gray hair framed her face with a quiet elegance, and her deep brown eyes, still sharp after all these years, met her own gaze. There was strength in those eyes. There always had been. She had fought too hard to let a moment like this break her. But what did it mean to be someone so unseen by the world, yet so profoundly visible to everyone who assumed her existence? The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. As she stepped inside, the soft hum of the machine and the rhythmic movement downward offered a moment of peace, a brief respite from the storm building around her. She pressed the button for the top floor, where her office was located, the one place she could retreat to think, to regroup. The doors closed with a soft whoosh, and Patricia leaned against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. In her mind, the memory of the shove was still fresh. The feel of the officer's hand against her back, the way he had made her feel like nothing more than an obstacle in his way. His arrogance had been palpable, as if he were entitled to treat her however he wished. But what he hadn't known, what he couldn't have known, was how much more she had experienced. How much more she had withstood. She had built this mall with the sweat of her brow. She had built it on the foundation of her experiences, her dreams, her blood, and her will. Patricia wasn't just an old woman in a cane. She was a living testament to everything people thought they could take from her. Her entire life had been a constant battle, from the first time she walked into this town with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, to the day she signed the papers that made Kingston Mall hers. She'd done it all, fought, built, risen. And yet, there were still people who thought they could tear her down with a shove. The elevator came to a gentle stop, and the doors slid open. Patricia stepped out, her posture unchanged. She didn't rush. Her presence was too commanding for that. She walked down the long corridor to her office, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. There were no employees in sight. Most had already gone for the day, but Patricia knew her presence would be felt. Her office was at the end of the hall, a quiet space where she could work in solitude, far away from the crowds. As she entered the room, she saw the familiar sight of her desk, a sturdy, mahogany piece that had seen years of decisions, deals, and documents. It was her sanctuary, her place of power. She sat in the high-backed leather chair and stared out the window. The view from her office was a reflection of her success. Below, the entire mall sprawled out, bustling with life. It was a symbol of her triumph, a testament to the world she had created from nothing. But today it felt different. It felt like a battleground. Her fingers drummed lightly on the desk as her mind churned. How could she let this slide? The officer had shoved her, not knowing who she was, not understanding that she held the power of this place in her hands. But it wasn't just about the physical shove, it was about the dismissal, the dehumanization. He had seen her as nothing more than an obstacle in his path, just like so many had before. And for a moment, Patricia wondered if the world had truly changed, or if she was still fighting the same battles she had fought all her life. Patricia's hand moved to the drawer, where she kept the photo of her late husband James. It had been taken years ago, on the day they signed the final paperwork to purchase the mall. She smiled at the memory, the image of them both standing proud and full of hope, their dreams ahead of them. He had always believed in her, in their shared vision. She missed him every day. But this was something she could handle. He had taught her that, never back down, never let the world make you feel small. Patricia looked at the photo for a moment longer before she closed the drawer, her mind made up. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She picked up the phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. It was time to make a call she had never thought she'd have to make. The call that would change everything. Patricia spent the night in her office, the quiet hum of the mall drifting through the walls as she stared at the glowing skyline outside her window. Kingston Mall had always been her sanctuary, the one place where she could feel truly in control. The lights flickered on in the shops below, casting soft shadows against the glass. For a brief moment, Patricia allowed herself to reflect on the long road that had brought her here. The struggles, the battles, the moments of victory, and the occasional loss. But this was different. This was a new fight, and Patricia knew it would be unlike any she had faced before. The officer's shove wasn't just an attack on her, it was an attack on everything she had worked for. Every person who had doubted her, every face that had looked at her with suspicion or disbelief, had finally revealed themselves. They thought they could push her around. But Patricia had been through worse. She had learned, through decades of struggle, that the true power came not in pushing back with violence, but in the quiet, unyielding resolve that no one could take away from her. She had learned to make her presence known without ever raising her voice. Her success wasn't born out of loud, brash gestures. It was built on patience, strength, and the steady, relentless pursuit of a dream that no one could take from her. But as she sat there, in the dim light of her office, she knew one thing. This officer had no idea who he had just shoved. It was time for him to learn. The phone on her desk rang, pulling Patricia from her thoughts. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the edges of the receiver, a gesture of calm she had perfected over the years. "Ma'am?" The voice on the other end was familiar, a voice she had trusted for years. "The meeting's scheduled for 10. Are you still planning to attend?" Patricia closed her eyes for a moment. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I'll be there." The voice hesitated for a moment. "We can reschedule if you need to?" "No," Patricia cut in. "It's time. I've waited long enough." She set the phone back down with quiet finality. It was nearly 9:30 a.m. when Patricia stepped out of her office and onto the elevator. She was dressed in her usual attire, elegant yet practical, a reflection of her no-nonsense attitude. Her cane was in hand, but she walked with the same steady rhythm that had carried her through so many years. Her silver-gray hair was tucked beneath a simple scarf, her eyes still as sharp as they had ever been. The elevator descended smoothly, and when the doors opened to the main floor, Patricia stepped out with the air of someone who owned the world around her. The mall was beginning to come to life, the familiar faces of employees setting up shop for another busy day. The sounds of the mall, footsteps, chatter, the faint hum of music, filled the air, but Patricia's focus was elsewhere. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the store entrances as she moved toward the back of the building where she knew the boardroom meeting would take place. But even with the bustle around her, there was a palpable tension in the air. Her presence was a reminder to those around her, though they didn't know it. To some, she was just another elderly woman. To others, she was a legend. And now, she would make sure everyone in this mall, including the officer, knew who she really was. The boardroom was quiet when Patricia entered. The members of her management team were already seated around the long, polished table, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. They had all seen Patricia face difficult situations before, but none like this. None that threatened the very heart of the mall they had built together. Patricia took her seat at the head of the table, her presence filling the space before she even spoke. "I called this meeting because of what happened yesterday," she began, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "And I need everyone here to understand something. No one is going to treat me like that again." A murmur ran through the room, but Patricia's eyes cut through them, steady and unwavering. She wasn't speaking to be heard, she was speaking to make a point. "We've worked too hard, and we've built too much for anyone to think they can push us around," she continued. "That officer, he thought I was just another old woman, a face to forget. But I will not allow anyone, especially someone in uniform, to degrade me or this place I've spent my life creating. This is my world, my legacy. And it's time everyone around here understands that." A young man sitting near the far end of the table spoke up. "Ma'am, we understand. But what do you want us to do about it?" Patricia looked at him, her gaze softening slightly. "I want you to stand with me. But most of all, I want you to know that there's a power in this place, a power that none of us can afford to ignore. We're not just a mall. We're a community. And I will do whatever it takes to protect that community." Her words lingered in the air, the room silent as the gravity of what she was saying sunk in. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was laying down the law, and everyone in that room could feel it. As the meeting went on, Patricia's mind wandered back to the young officer, to the shove that had ignited this fire within her. She didn't know what his future held, but she knew this. No matter what happened, he would never look at her the same way again. He had no idea who she was, but he was about to find out. Patricia Williams wasn't someone who could be pushed aside. By the time the meeting adjourned, Patricia had already set her plan in motion. The next step wasn't just about confronting the officer. It was about making sure everyone knew where the line was drawn. She wasn't just a woman who had built a mall. She was a woman who had built her world. A world that had been earned, not given. The days that followed the encounter in the mall passed in a haze. The world around Patricia moved as it always had, but the weight of that single moment, the shove, the arrogance of the officer, hung over her like a dark cloud. It wasn't the physical impact that had shaken her. It was the sudden realization of how easily people could assume power over others, how small a thing could make someone feel less than human. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about the principle of it all, the reminder that no one, no matter how much they had built, was immune from being pushed aside. Patricia hadn't yet confronted the officer. She hadn't spoken to him, nor had she made a scene. That wasn't her way. The right moment hadn't come yet, and she knew that the consequences of her actions would be far-reaching. She wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for the community, the legacy of strength she had fought so hard to build. But with every passing hour, the pressure of the encounter weighed heavier on her, and she knew she could no longer stay silent. She had already made her decision. She would act, not in haste, not out of anger, but with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through every challenge in her life. It was mid-morning when she walked into her office at the top of Kingston Mall. The sunlight streamed in through the large windows, casting long shadows across the room. She had always loved the way the light hit her desk, the way it seemed to spotlight her in the midst of everything. It made her feel like she was at the center of it all, where she belonged. Her office, like everything in the mall, was a reflection of who she was: elegant, understated, and powerful. The walls were lined with bookshelves full of business reports, legal documents, and journals filled with her notes, reminders of everything she had done to get here. But today, it wasn't the paperwork that mattered. Today, it was the letter sitting on her desk. The letter was from the police department. It was the officer's official report about the incident. Patricia had known it was coming. She had expected it. But when she opened the envelope, the sting of reading his account, his version of what had happened, still cut deep. He had written it as if the shove had been an accident. As if he hadn't made the deliberate choice to push her aside. His tone was dismissive, as though the entire event had been nothing more than a momentary lapse. And in his eyes, there was nothing wrong with his actions. He was just doing his job, wasn't he? The words on the paper blurred in her vision for a moment, but Patricia steadied herself. She wasn't going to get lost in the rage. It wouldn't do any good. Instead, she stood up, placing the letter aside, and walked over to the window, staring out at the sprawling mall below. The view was almost comforting in its familiarity, but today it felt different. Today, Patricia saw the mall as something more than just her property. It was a symbol of everything she had overcome. The walls she had built weren't just physical. They were emotional too, shaped by years of fighting for respect, for her rightful place in the world. She had fought for this. And no one, not this officer, not anyone, was going to tear it down with a shove. By the time the officer, Trent Maddox, arrived at the mall for his scheduled shift, he was already dreading the meeting. He hadn't slept well the night before, replaying the incident over and over in his mind, wondering what had gone wrong. He had expected a simple interaction. He had expected to handle the situation with authority and move on. But it hadn't been that simple, had it? There had been something in Patricia's eyes. Something that unsettled him. Her calmness. The way she didn't back down. She had been nothing like the people he usually dealt with, people who cowered, people who shrank away when he raised his voice. But not her. Patricia Williams had stood tall. She had seen him, and it was clear she wasn't going to be intimidated by his badge. And that realization gnawed at him. He entered the mall through the back entrance, his uniform a stark contrast to the casual shoppers and store employees moving about. The sounds of the mall, the faint chatter and the jingle of the register bells, seemed distant, almost muffled in his ears. He passed by the store windows, glancing at the displays that meant nothing to him, until he reached the elevator that would take him to the top floor, where Patricia's office was. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and he stepped inside, the silence inside the small cabin making his palms sweat. His fingers hovered over the button to Patricia's floor, but he hesitated for a moment, unsure. His mind raced. Was he doing the right thing? Was he making the right choice in going to see her? The confrontation from the day before weighed heavily on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the wrong side of it. The elevator began its ascent, the steady hum filling the space between him and the decision he had to make. When the doors finally opened, Patricia's office was just down the hall. He stepped out and paused for a moment, taking in the quiet, the stillness that seemed to radiate from her space. As he walked down the corridor, he felt something shift within him, a subtle realization that this wasn't just another interaction. This wasn't just another apology. This was something much deeper, something that had to be confronted. Patricia's door was open. He could hear her voice on the phone as he approached, but she fell silent when she saw him. Her eyes met his, cool, steady, unwavering. For a moment, there was no sound. No words. Just the weight of their silence. "Sit down," she said, her voice calm but commanding. He hesitated for a moment before sitting across from her. The air between them seemed thick, like it was charged with something unsaid. Something heavy. Patricia folded her hands on the desk, staring at him with an intensity that made his stomach turn. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even disappointed. She was just waiting. Waiting for him to acknowledge what had happened. Finally, she spoke. "I'm not here to make excuses for you, Officer Maddox," she said softly, but the sharpness of her words cut through the stillness. "But you owe me more than an apology. You owe me respect. And I'll be damned if I let you or anyone else take that from me." His throat went dry. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Do you understand me?" she asked, her voice unyielding. For the first time since the incident, he felt small. He nodded. "Good," Patricia said, leaning back in her chair. "Now we move forward." And no one, no matter how young, no matter how powerful, would ever forget that again. The day after their meeting, the officer's words lingered in Patricia's mind like an echo. He had tried to apologize, fumbling with his words, his voice laced with guilt and regret. But Patricia had seen it before. A man unsure of himself, standing in front of someone who wasn't going to let his mistakes go unaddressed. She had watched him squirm in her office, not because of his remorse, but because he had finally realized the depth of his miscalculation. And she hadn't let him off the hook. Not yet. Patricia was no stranger to having people underestimate her. Whether it was her age, her race, or simply the fact that she wasn't loud, brash, or overtly aggressive, people often mistook her for someone easy to dismiss. But in her lifetime, Patricia had learned that strength didn't always need to roar. Sometimes, it was silent. Sometimes, it was about standing your ground when the world expected you to fall. She had built Kingston Mall from nothing. Nothing. Raised it brick by brick, fought for every contract, and never once let the world tell her what she could and couldn't do. And now, an officer, half her age, with a badge on his chest, had dared to shove her aside as if she didn't matter. As if her life, her accomplishments, her legacy, were less than his authority. That mistake would not go unchallenged. Patricia sat at her desk the morning after the confrontation, a cup of coffee in hand, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim. She had already begun making calls. One in particular had been made to a lawyer she trusted, someone who knew how to navigate the complexities of the law in ways that wouldn't make waves but would create ripples. She wasn't going to involve the media, not yet. She had learned the hard way that some battles were better fought in private, with strategy, not spectacle. This was about more than the officer. It was about making sure no one else in her world, in her mall, ever felt that same weight of disrespect. The phone rang, snapping her from her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID, a name she recognized immediately. "Good morning, Patricia," came the voice on the other end. "How are you today?" It was James, her old friend and lawyer. He had been there for her for years, always with a steady, calming voice when things got complicated. They had handled business dealings, contracts, and even minor disputes, but nothing quite like this. "Morning, James." "I'm fine," she said, her tone calm but firm. "I need you to prepare something for me. A letter. Official. I'll need it delivered to the officer." James was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure about this? You know it's going to escalate things. It could stir up more than just a simple apology." "I'm sure," Patricia replied, her voice unwavering. "He needs to be held accountable. And not just him. We can't let anyone think they can walk over us, me, without understanding the consequences." There was a pause, and then James spoke again, quieter this time. "I'll handle it, Patricia. I'll make sure it's done right." Patricia nodded even though he couldn't see her. "Thank you." By the time the sun began to set, Patricia had composed herself. She had already drafted her response to the officer, carefully worded, not in anger, but in the kind of measured language that would make him understand the gravity of what he had done. Not just to her, but to everyone around her. It wasn't about seeking vengeance. It was about ensuring that he understood that power came with responsibility. That authority wasn't just something you could wield carelessly. It had consequences. And Patricia wasn't going to be a passive victim to anyone's misjudgment. As she finished her last cup of coffee, her thoughts turned to the mall again. To everything she had built. To every tenant, every shop owner, every single person who had trusted her with their livelihoods. She was their protector. It wasn't just about her. It was about the whole community. She stood up from her desk, her back straight, shoulders squared. Her eyes lingered on the photo on her desk, her and James, standing outside the original plans for Kingston Mall, hopeful and full of dreams. "Not today," she whispered to herself. "Not ever again." Later that evening, the officer arrived at the mall, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. He had been called in to meet with Patricia, and as he entered the building, the weight of the situation hung in the air. He had made the mistake of thinking his badge made him untouchable. And now, as he walked down the quiet corridor toward her office, he was finally beginning to realize how wrong he had been. He knocked lightly on the door, and without waiting for an invitation, entered. Patricia sat behind her desk, as composed as ever. Her hands rested lightly on the polished wood, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him falter. "You're here to apologize, I assume," Patricia said calmly, her voice like smooth stone, unyielding. The officer, whose name was Trent Maddox, took a step into the room. His face was flushed with regret, but there was still a certain defensiveness in his posture, the way he stood with his arms crossed. He wasn't sure how to approach her. "Look, I'm sorry about what happened," he began, his voice shaky, not knowing where to start. "I wasn't thinking when I did it. It was a mistake." Patricia didn't speak immediately. She just watched him, her gaze piercing, knowing that his apology wasn't enough. He had no idea the weight of what she had endured in her life, and she wasn't sure he could ever understand. "You were wrong," she finally said. "And I'm not just talking about the shove. I'm talking about the disrespect. You thought you could push me aside. You thought you could erase everything I've built with a single gesture. And that," she paused, her voice colder now, "that is something I will not let slide." The officer looked down, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean to." "I know what you meant," Patricia interrupted. "But your intent doesn't change the impact of your actions. And that's what you need to understand. You owe me more than an apology, Officer Maddox. You owe me respect. But more than that, you owe it to every person in this mall to understand the consequences of your actions." She stood up, her gaze never leaving him. "You don't just walk into people's lives and push them aside. You don't just take what you think you're entitled to. People like me, we don't let that happen. We never have." There was a long silence between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Patricia spoke again. "This is your lesson. Learn from it. And remember it." The days that followed the meeting with Officer Maddox were quiet, but only on the surface. Kingston Mall had its usual rhythm, shoppers wandering through the storefronts, employees greeting regulars with warm smiles, and the hum of life continuing as though nothing had changed. But to Patricia, everything had changed. She spent her days overseeing the operations of the mall, sitting in her office, but her thoughts were far away, constantly circling the same question: What next? She had addressed the officer. She had laid the foundation for what needed to be done, but there was still a deeper decision she had to make. A choice that, no matter how small it seemed to others, would ripple through everything she had built. The officer had apologized, but that was never going to be enough. Apologies were easy. The real question was whether he understood what had happened. Whether he would learn from his mistake or dismiss it as an isolated incident. The morning sun poured through her office window, casting long shadows over the polished floor. Patricia sat in her leather chair, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her desk, deep in thought. Her mind was still sharp as it always had been. She wasn't one to be swayed by emotional outbursts or rash decisions. Everything she had done in her life had been deliberate, calculated. And the course of action she took now would be no different. Patricia's phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her reverie. The name on the screen was familiar, a local reporter from a small but reputable news outlet. She picked up the receiver, pressing it to her ear. "Good morning, Patricia." The voice on the other end was polite but cautious. "I'm calling about the incident at Kingston Mall. I wanted to know if you're willing to comment on what happened with Officer Maddox." Patricia's brow furrowed slightly, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm not interested in making a public spectacle of it," she said evenly. "What happened was a personal matter between myself and the officer. I've dealt with it privately, and I don't believe it's anyone's business beyond that." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The reporter hesitated, then spoke again, this time more carefully. "Of course, I understand. But, with all due respect, Patricia, this is more than just a personal matter. You own Kingston Mall, the heart of this community. People are talking and they're wondering why you haven't come forward." Patricia leaned back in her chair, her fingers still drumming on the desk. She could hear the subtle insistence in the reporter's tone, the pressure to make a statement. The desire to turn her struggle into something bigger than it was. But that was never her way. "I'm not in the business of feeding public curiosity," she said, her voice firm. "I've built a life here, and that's where my focus lies. What matters most to me is that people who walk through these doors feel safe, respected, and valued. The rest? It's noise." Another pause, this time longer. The reporter understood the finality of her words. "Understood, Patricia. Thank you for your time." The line went silent, and Patricia set the receiver back down, a quiet resolve settling over her. She wasn't interested in media attention or sensationalism. What she wanted was simple: respect, accountability, and to make sure that the small act of pushing her, of dismissing her, didn't become a norm. She wouldn't let it. Later that afternoon, as the last of the mall's shops began to close for the evening, Patricia stood by the large glass windows of her office, looking out at the street below. The world outside had shifted, but she hadn't. She wasn't going to let herself be defined by this incident. She had too much to lose. Too much to protect. The mall wasn't just a building, it was a community. Her community. And she had built it with every ounce of strength she had. But the world was different now. It was more volatile, more fractured. And that officer, who thought he could push her aside with a single shove, was a reminder of the deep currents of prejudice that still ran beneath the surface. They could be subtle, even unnoticed by most, but Patricia knew them for what they were. She had seen them before, when she was younger, when she was trying to find her place in a world that didn't want to make space for her. She had fought against those currents with everything she had. And now, she found herself fighting again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Patricia had always known that her strength didn't come from the buildings she owned or the wealth she had amassed. It came from the people she surrounded herself with, the ones who trusted her, who believed in her, and who worked alongside her. The mall was just the physical manifestation of something much bigger. It was the soul of a community, and Patricia was its beating heart. She turned away from the window, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of her desk as she reached for the papers in front of her. She had already made a decision, and it was time to put it into action. Patricia had never been one to sit idly by. She wasn't going to let the officer walk away from this without understanding what he had done. She wasn't going to let him continue in his ignorance, not while she had the power to teach him. She picked up the phone again, dialing the number she had kept close to her chest. The call went through after a few rings. "Patricia," came the voice on the other end. "I'm glad you called." "It's time," Patricia said, her voice steady. "I need you to arrange a meeting with Officer Maddox. He's going to hear from me directly." There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice spoke again with understanding. "I'll make it happen. But you know this won't be easy, right? He's going to fight it." Patricia smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "He's already fought it. Now it's my turn." The days that followed moved quickly. Patricia knew that the time had come to make her move, to bring closure to the encounter that had sparked a fire inside her. She had already contacted the officer's superiors, and they had agreed to meet. She knew it wasn't going to be a simple conversation. She was prepared for resistance, for defensiveness, but she was also prepared to stand her ground. As the meeting day arrived, Patricia dressed in her finest, a tailored suit that spoke of both elegance and strength. Her cane rested beside her, a silent symbol of her journey. She was not the frail woman the officer had thought she was. She was a woman who had fought for every inch of ground she stood on, and no one would ever take that from her. When she arrived at the designated meeting room, she could feel the tension in the air. The officer's presence loomed at the far end of the table, his posture stiff, his eyes avoiding hers. He was clearly uncomfortable, uncertain. But Patricia was calm. She had lived through far worse than this. She sat down, the sharp sound of the chair scraping against the floor the only sound in the room. And then, without a word, she waited. The officer looked up, meeting her gaze, and Patricia knew that this would be the moment he realized he wasn't dealing with just any woman. He was facing the full weight of her legacy. The room felt smaller than it was, the tension thickening the air with every passing second. The heavy mahogany table between Patricia and Officer Trent Maddox seemed to amplify the distance between them, but Patricia didn't need proximity to feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't the physical space that mattered, it was the silence. It was the quiet before the storm. The space where everything was about to change. Patricia sat perfectly still, her fingers gently resting on the surface of the table. Her cane, always by her side, leaned against her chair, a silent partner in her steadfast calm. The officer's uniform was crisp, but it didn't carry the same authority it once had in the officer's eyes. He had been stripped of that confidence, the arrogance of his badge now crumbling under the weight of his mistake. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clasped together in front of him, his jaw clenched. Every muscle in his body was tense, betraying the uncertainty he tried so hard to conceal. Patricia could see it. She had always been able to read people, to understand the subtle signals of fear or doubt that they couldn't hide. This officer was afraid. She didn't know if it was because of the way she had handled the situation or because of the consequences that were looming over him. But the fact remained, he wasn't the same man who had shoved her aside in the mall. Now, he was sitting across from her, facing the full force of her gaze, and the force of everything she had worked for. For a long moment, Patricia didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was heavy, a deliberate, powerful stillness that seemed to weigh down the air between them. The officer's discomfort grew. "I didn't mean to disrespect you," Officer Maddox finally said, his voice low, tinged with regret. It wasn't supposed to be like that." Patricia's eyes never left his. She had heard the words, but they didn't matter. Words were easy. They were cheap. Actions, however, they spoke volumes. "You were wrong," Patricia said simply, her voice steady but firm, each word carrying the weight of her years. "It's not about your apology, Officer Maddox. It's about accountability." His eyes flickered, and for the first time, there was a hint of understanding in his gaze. But Patricia wasn't finished. She had always known that people didn't change overnight. They didn't learn from their mistakes just because they said they were sorry. Change was slow. It took time, patience, and most of all, it took the willingness to face the consequences of those actions. She leaned forward, her voice now tinged with authority. "You thought you could push me aside. You thought because I'm older, because I'm a woman, because you didn't think I had any power, you could do whatever you wanted. But what you didn't know is that I've been here longer than you've been alive. This mall, this community, it's mine. And it's earned. You don't just get to come in here and treat people like that. The officer looked down, clearly struggling to meet her gaze. He had never encountered anyone like her. He had faced hundreds of situations where his authority went unchallenged, where his uniform gave him power. But this was different. This wasn't just an old woman. This was a woman who had earned her place in the world, someone who commanded respect without ever having to raise her voice. Patricia's words hung in the air, lingering like smoke. The officer shifted again, uncomfortable, but Patricia wasn't done. You don't know what it's like, she continued, her voice growing quieter but more intense. You don't know what it's like to fight for everything you have. To walk into rooms where people look right through you, where they don't think you belong. I've fought for this mall, for this community, for every single person who has trusted me. And for you to come here and dismiss me like I'm nothing, you don't get to do that. The silence in the room deepened, the weight of her words sinking into the officer's chest. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Patricia didn't need him to speak. She wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. She had already heard it, but words didn't erase actions. What mattered now was understanding, whether he was ready to face the reality of his mistake and what it meant. Patricia sat back in her chair, her gaze softening just slightly. You're not just apologizing to me. You're apologizing to this community. To the people who work here. To the people who trust me to protect them. She paused, letting the weight of that sink in. Then, she added softly, and I'm not sure you understand that yet. But I think you will. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor. He had been so certain of his position before. So sure of himself, his authority, his power. But now, in the face of someone who had earned their place, who had lived through the very prejudices he didn't even see, he was nothing more than a boy trying to hold onto the last shred of his fragile power. Patricia didn't want to break him. She wasn't interested in vengeance. But she knew that the only way to change people was to force them to see the world through another's eyes. She knew that if he walked away from this without truly understanding the depth of what he had done, he would do it again. After a long, tense silence, Officer Maddox finally spoke. His voice was small, almost timid now. I didn't know. I didn't realize what I was doing. Patricia nodded, her expression still calm. I know you didn't, but that's why I'm here. To make sure you understand it now. And to make sure that it doesn't happen again. For the first time since he had entered the room, the officer looked up, meeting her gaze. And in that moment, Patricia saw something she hadn't expected, sincerity. I won't forget this, he said, his voice low but earnest. Patricia's gaze softened. I hope you don't. Because this isn't just about me. It's about making sure everyone in this mall, everyone who walks through these doors, knows they are respected. And that we will not let anyone, no matter who they are, take that away from us. The officer nodded, slowly rising from his seat. There was a new understanding in his eyes, a shift. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. This encounter with Patricia Williams had changed him. He would never look at her the same way again. He stepped toward the door but paused, turning back to her. Thank you. For making me see what I didn't. Patricia's lips curled into a faint smile. The real work begins now, Officer Maddox. You've taken the first step. But there's still a long road ahead. As the door closed behind him, Patricia sat there for a moment, taking a slow breath. She had done what she needed to do, not just for herself, but for everyone who depended on her. This wasn't about power. It was about legacy, the quiet strength that comes from knowing exactly who you are, what you've built, and never allowing anyone to tear it down. Not now, not ever. She stood up, straightened her coat, and walked toward the window, looking down at the mall below. This was her world. The days that followed the confrontation felt strangely still, as if the world was holding its breath. Kingston Mall continued its usual rhythm, shops opening, employees bustling, customers making their way through the gleaming halls, but for Patricia, nothing felt the same. The atmosphere had shifted, and though no one spoke of it aloud, it was palpable in the air. The officer, Trent Maddox, had apologized, and though his words had not been enough to erase the sting of the previous encounter, they had been a step toward something else, something Patricia couldn't yet name. But it wasn't just the officer who had changed. Patricia had been running Kingston Mall for more than 3 decades. The mall wasn't just a business to her. It was her legacy, her fortress, and now, it seemed like the quiet strength she had carried for so many years was becoming something more. Something that would be tested in ways she never expected. She had spent her life fighting battles, both big and small, but nothing had prepared her for what she was facing now, a world that seemed to see her as nothing more than a relic. An old woman, past her prime. And yet, here she was, standing at the very center of a storm she had never asked for, but one she would weather nonetheless. It was just after dawn when Patricia stepped into her office, the soft light of morning filtering through the windows, casting a golden glow across the walls. She didn't move right away. Instead, she stood there for a moment, letting the calmness of the room settle into her. For years, she had worked tirelessly to build this place. Every brick, every window, every decision. She had done it all with grit and persistence, knowing that this mall would become a reflection of her strength, her resilience. But now, it felt as though the weight of her past was bearing down on her more than ever. The past, and the fact that some still didn't fully understand what it meant to be Patricia Williams. Patricia's fingers hovered over the papers on her desk. They were the usual business matters, leases, contracts, financial reports, but she couldn't focus on them today. Her mind kept drifting back to Officer Maddox, to the meeting in her office, to the way he had looked at her, the shift in his demeanor when he finally understood who she was. She had seen that shift many times before. In business meetings, in boardrooms, in the eyes of men who thought they could control the narrative. But this was different. Maddox wasn't just an officer with a badge. He was a person, and he had learned the hardest lesson a man like him could learn, the weight of humility. Patricia took a deep breath and sat down at her desk, pushing the papers aside. She picked up the phone and dialed the number she had been meaning to call. The phone rang twice before the line was answered. "James," Patricia said, her voice steady. "I need you to come by. I've got something to discuss." James, her trusted lawyer, had been by her side for years. He had helped her navigate the intricacies of business deals, legal challenges, and most recently, personal matters that she never thought she'd need help with. But this was different. This wasn't just about contracts or negotiations. This was about integrity, honor, and respect. And now, more than ever, Patricia needed James to understand that this battle was not hers alone to fight. The phone line crackled, and then James's voice came through clearly. "Of course, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Patricia nodded to herself. This wasn't just a legal matter. This was about something far more significant, something that would affect not just Kingston Mall, but every person in her life, from the employees to the tenants to the community. It was about the power to protect what she had built. 20 minutes later, the door to her office creaked open, and James stepped in. He was a tall, wiry man, his gray hair just beginning to thin at the temples. He was wearing his usual suit, neat, practical, and professional, but today, there was a certain unease in his posture. He knew something had shifted, but he wasn't sure what. "Patricia," he said, setting his briefcase down on the desk. "What's going on?" She didn't hesitate. "I need your help with something," she began. "The officer, Maddox. He came by yesterday. We had a conversation. And now I need to know what my options are." James raised an eyebrow, but he didn't ask her to elaborate. He knew Patricia well enough to understand that when she said options, she meant something far more intricate than just legal matters. "You want to press charges?" he asked carefully. "Or is this about something else?" Patricia shook her head, her eyes steady. "I don't want to make a spectacle of this. What I want is for him, and everyone else, to understand that actions have consequences. You can't just walk into someone's life and dismiss them like they're nothing. And you certainly can't push them aside without facing the consequences." James was quiet for a moment, taking in her words. "So, what are you thinking?" "I want to make sure this doesn't happen again," Patricia said, her voice firm, resolute. "I don't want this to be about revenge. I want it to be about accountability. About making sure that the next time someone comes into my space, they understand the respect that's due. Not just to me, but to everyone who's part of what I've built here." James nodded slowly, his eyes focused on hers. "You've always been about building something that lasts," he said, his voice quiet but filled with respect. "I understand." Patricia stood up, walking toward the window again, looking out at the mall below. The sun was high now, casting long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, she could see it all: the legacy she had built, the people who trusted her, and the community she had shaped. It was more than just a mall. It was a living, breathing testament to everything she had fought for. "Tell me what to do next," Patricia said, her back still to him, her voice low but full of determination. "What's the best way to make sure this officer understands that actions like his have consequences?" James stood there for a moment, considering her words carefully. "The most effective way is to make sure this doesn't fade away into nothing. You need to put this on the record. You need a formal complaint filed, not just against him, but also against the department for allowing this kind of behavior to go unchecked. That way, there's a paper trail. If it comes to something bigger, you'll be covered." Patricia nodded slowly, her hand resting lightly on the windowsill. "I don't want this to be just about him. I want it to be about what this means for everyone. For the people who work here, for the families who depend on this place. This is bigger than one man's mistake. This is about making sure we're not just a space, but a community that stands together." James smiled slightly. "You've always known how to turn something personal into something bigger. I'll get started on the paperwork." Patricia finally turned back to face him, her eyes steady, her expression resolute. "And don't forget, James, this isn't just a fight for me. It's for everyone who's ever been dismissed, overlooked, or pushed aside. They need to know that this place is their place. And it will always be protected." As James left her office, Patricia stood there for a long moment, staring out the window. She knew what was coming. She knew this wouldn't be easy. But she also knew that no one, not this officer, not anyone, would ever forget who she was again. The quiet storm that had been building inside her was about to break wide open. And it was going to stay that way. The week that followed felt like a quiet storm, the kind that slowly builds with tension but doesn't reveal its true force until the very last moment. Kingston Mall, the heart of the community, continued to thrive in its usual rhythm, but Patricia felt the subtle shifts beneath the surface. People spoke in hushed tones, exchanged glances when they thought she wasn't looking, and there was a new sense of awareness among the employees, the tenants, even the security guards. Everyone knew that something had changed, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. The officer, Trent Maddox, had remained mostly absent. Patricia didn't know where he had gone, and at this point, she didn't care. He had done what he came to do, shove her aside, show his power, and now he was paying the price for that arrogance. But for Patricia, the matter wasn't about him anymore. It was about ensuring that the space she had created, the place she had built from the ground up, wasn't tainted by that same arrogance. She had made her choice. She had called for accountability. And now, it was a matter of watching the pieces fall into place. Patricia sat at her desk, the sun now low in the sky, casting long shadows over the room. She had spent the day going over business reports, making sure everything was in order. Her mind, however, was somewhere else. Somewhere far beyond the walls of her office. The call to James earlier in the week had been the first step. But now, there were other calls to make. Calls that would ensure that the officer's actions wouldn't be forgotten. But it was more than that. There was still the matter of the community. Her community, the one that had grown around the mall over the years. It wasn't just the tenants and the employees. It was everyone who walked through those doors, who found refuge in the familiarity of the place, who trusted her to ensure their safety. She had worked tirelessly to create an environment where no one would ever feel unseen, unheard. But now, the very thing that made Kingston Mall what it was had been challenged. And Patricia couldn't let that slide. The phone rang, breaking her from her thoughts. It was James. She picked it up, her fingers brushing the receiver with practiced ease. "Patricia," James's voice came through, a mixture of relief and urgency. "The paperwork's been filed. I've sent everything over to the department. They're going to investigate the incident with Officer Maddox. They're going to look into the report he submitted, and we'll see where this goes. Patricia closed her eyes for a moment, letting the gravity of his words sink in. She wasn't naive. She knew it wasn't going to be an easy process. But it was a necessary one. Good, she said, her voice steady. But it can't just be about Maddox. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. We need to set a precedent for how people like him, people who think their badge gives them the right to treat others as lesser, are held accountable. There was a long pause before James spoke again. You're not backing down, are you? Patricia smiled faintly. I never have. The next few days passed with an eerie stillness. The paperwork was filed, and the investigation had begun, but Patricia wasn't waiting for the outcome. She had already made up her mind. The world she had fought for, the one that she had built brick by brick, needed more than a single apology. It needed to be reinforced. It needed to be protected. As she walked through the mall the following morning, Patricia's footsteps echoed off the polished floors, the sound sharp and steady. She could hear the voices of the employees in the background, the sound of the cash registers ringing up sales, the faint hum of the air conditioning that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. But despite the noise, everything felt quieter. It was as though the mall itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The walls, which had once felt like a fortress, now felt like a battleground. And Patricia, the matriarch, stood at the center of it all. She passed by the familiar storefronts, the jewelry shop, the clothing boutiques, the cafe that served the best coffee in the city, and stopped in front of one of the smaller stores. The owner, a young woman named Lauren, was just finishing up a conversation with a customer. When she saw Patricia, she smiled warmly. Good morning, ma'am, Lauren said, her voice cheerful, but Patricia noticed the slight hesitation in her eyes. How are you today? Patricia smiled back, though it didn't reach her eyes. I'm well. How are you? Lauren's smile faltered, and she hesitated before speaking again. I heard about what happened the other day, she said quietly. With the officer. Are you all right? Patricia nodded, her gaze steady. I'm fine, Lauren. Thank you for asking. The young woman seemed relieved but still unsure. I just wanted to say, thank you. For standing up. For all of us. Patricia's heart tightened at the sincerity in Lauren's voice. She had never been one for public displays of gratitude. She didn't need applause or praise. But to hear those words, spoken so honestly, filled her with a quiet sense of pride. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about everyone who had ever felt like they didn't matter. Everyone who had been treated as invisible. Thank you, Patricia said softly. It's important that we all stand up for each other. This mall isn't just mine, it's all of ours. And we protect it. Together. Later that afternoon, as Patricia returned to her office, she saw a familiar figure standing outside the door. It was Officer Maddox. He was waiting for her. Patricia's heart didn't skip a beat. She had known this moment was coming. He had asked for a second meeting, a chance to speak to her in private. But Patricia wasn't going to give him the chance to explain his actions away. Not anymore. She opened the door and stood in front of him, her posture as firm as ever. You wanted to speak with me? Patricia asked, her voice even, her gaze unwavering. Officer Maddox looked different now. The arrogance that had once been there was gone, replaced by a quiet wariness, a hint of shame. He didn't speak at first, his gaze flickering to the floor as if searching for the right words. I wanted to apologize again, he said, his voice rough, almost hesitant. For what I did. It was wrong. I didn't realize who you were, or how much you meant to this place. To this community. Patricia didn't interrupt. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. I was out of line, Maddox continued, his voice growing softer. I don't know why I did it, but I do know that I was wrong. Patricia nodded slowly, but there was no sense of relief in her expression. No forgiveness. Not yet. I understand, she said after a moment. But this isn't just about an apology. It's about understanding the bigger picture. You need to understand that actions like yours have consequences. And you need to make sure this doesn't happen again. Not just here, but everywhere. Maddox looked up at her, his eyes filled with something between remorse and resolve. I will. I promise. Patricia took a step back, her gaze steady, but softened slightly. "Good. I'm glad you understand. Now, go make sure you're part of the change, not the problem." As he left her office, Patricia remained standing, her heart steady in the silence. This wasn't over, not yet. But this was the start of something new, a quiet reckoning that had begun to shift the tides. She had made her stand. And now, the world would see the power of a legacy built on strength, dignity, and resilience. The air in the mall seemed to carry a different energy now. There was a subtle shift, as though everyone was more aware, more conscious of what had happened. But it wasn't just the officer's apology or the investigation that had changed the atmosphere. It was something deeper, something that had always been present but had been brought into sharper focus. The truth about power, respect, and the legacy Patricia had built over the years. Patricia had always known the importance of silence. It wasn't just about not speaking, it was about the strength that came from being heard without ever needing to raise your voice. And it was in that silence that her message had been clear. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to make a spectacle. She simply had to be. But there was still something left unsaid, something that Patricia couldn't leave unresolved. She had confronted Officer Maddox, but the echoes of that moment continued to reverberate in her mind. The shove, the arrogance, the reminder that power wasn't just about position, it was about understanding. And now, it was time for the world to truly understand the full weight of her legacy. The days following the officer's apology were filled with meetings, calls, and subtle shifts in the community. There were no protests, no grand displays of solidarity. But beneath the surface, Patricia could feel the change. People were starting to ask questions. They were starting to reflect. It wasn't just about one officer's misstep. It was about something deeper, the way society saw power, respect, and the people who had built their lives without ever being acknowledged. It was about standing up not because you had to, but because you deserved to. And Patricia had reminded them all of that. As she sat in her office, reflecting on the journey that had led her here, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Patricia called softly. The door opened, and in walked the mall's head of security, Malcolm, a man who had worked with Patricia for nearly 20 years. His face was etched with concern, but there was something else in his eyes, a respect, a quiet understanding. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up for all of us." Patricia raised an eyebrow, her expression calm. "I didn't do it for thanks, Malcolm." "I know," he said, his voice low. "But what you did, it's changed things around here. People are talking. They're thinking about what respect really means." Patricia smiled faintly, a subtle but powerful acknowledgement of the impact her actions had had. She didn't need applause or recognition. But hearing Malcolm speak like that, seeing the shift in his eyes, told her everything she needed to know. The change wasn't just personal, it was communal. And that was something worth fighting for. The conversation turned to business, to the tenants, to the future of the mall, but Patricia's mind was elsewhere. The world had seen her strength, but now she understood something else. Strength wasn't in what you did for yourself. It was in what you did for others. In making sure no one else was left behind. No one else was ever pushed aside again. The following weeks brought about changes that Patricia had anticipated but hadn't fully prepared for. The police department began their investigation into Officer Maddox, and the fallout from his actions rippled through the department, shaking up more than just his career. There were calls for accountability, not just from the public, but from within the system itself. The investigation, while ongoing, had already forced a few uncomfortable truths into the light. Truths about how easily power could be abused, how the vulnerable could be overlooked, and how every small act of injustice could build up to something much bigger. Patricia had not sought the attention, nor the recognition. But the simple fact was, she had forced the system to reckon with its own flaws. And in doing so, she had opened the door for those who had been overlooked for too long to finally stand tall. The mall was quieter than usual one afternoon when Patricia walked through its halls. The usual sounds of footsteps and chatter were muted today, replaced by something softer, more contemplative. It was the calm after the storm, but Patricia could sense the undercurrent of change, the ripple effect that had shifted the atmosphere of this place. As she passed by the coffee shop, the young barista looked up at her and gave a subtle nod. Patricia smiled, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. She didn't know it, but the barista wasn't the only one who had noticed. Others, too, had begun to see what had happened, not just to her, but to the collective spirit of Kingston Mall. The world, though imperfect, had shown her that change could come in small but profound ways. And it wasn't about grand gestures, it was about the quiet ripple of justice. The realization that no one was too small to make a difference, no one too unimportant to be heard. That evening, as Patricia made her way to her office, she paused at the window. The mall spread out beneath her, a sprawling network of light, activity, and life. She had built this place, yes, but it wasn't just about the walls or the businesses. It was about the people. It was about creating a place where people could come, work, live, and grow. A place that protected them, that valued them. She smiled softly, her gaze drifting across the familiar space. She had won, not because of the apology or the consequences, but because she had ensured that this space, her space, was one where respect would always be a part of the foundation. As she looked down at the mall, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Her battle hadn't been about revenge, it had been about dignity. And Patricia knew this. Dignity was something no one could ever take from her. Strength, dignity, and resilience. If you found Patricia's story as empowering as we did, take a moment to share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories that speak to the strength of the human spirit. Like if you believe that every individual, no matter their age or background, deserves respect. We want to hear your thoughts. Comment below and let us know how Patricia's journey resonates with you. How do you think the world can learn to listen more closely to voices that have been overlooked for too long? Let's talk.